Well, hello folks. My name is Cameron Nixon, and this is actually something that I couple requests from, and I actually want to thank Will Wight, my buddy, for getting me to actually do this. I really, what I want to try to accomplish with this is to get people to look at Hodographs in a slightly different way. And like, I don't want to make it sound like super profound or anything, but it really is. And we're basically getting the essence of like, okay, what is the Hodograph in its relationship to a supercell storm? That's the only mode that we'll cover with this, but there's a ton to explore, as I found out. Essentially what I want to try to do is get you to realize what a Hodograph looks like in a storm relative sense, right? Like you've seen Hodograph upon Hodograph upon Hodograph. There's a lot of differences in between those. And what I found is that if you bring those all together to just a simple storm relative sense, what the storm is actually feeling, and you look at it that way, you get a lot of profound insights into how the storm operates, how it looks like visually, especially for storm spotters, what the chasing difficulties would actually be with that. And then, lo and behold, different what am I trying to say, hazards that they could deal with, right? Or that they could deal, tornadoes, wind, hail. And it all starts, obviously, thermodynamics has a huge impact on all of this. But what I've noticed is that the Hodograph itself actually has a lot to say. So I guess we could start off by saying, like, your intuition itself is really powerful, and I'm going to show you how this is being used in looking at these Hodographs and how we could actually look at these in a less intuitive and more like methodical way. But if you were to take, for example, just picture the radar image in your mind of kind of like a mid-November tornado event, right? You see what that supercell looks like, right? Like it's got that string bean shape that we all know and love, like probably moving very fast. If you see that string bean shape, something's popping in your head saying, oh, it's probably moving kind of fast. It's probably not stationary. And if I were to ask you, well, is this supercell shape that you see on radar, is this your quintessential, beautiful mothership stationary storm? You're probably going to tell me no. And what I'm going to argue is that like you're coming to that conclusion for a reason. And a lot of this is going to be obvious at first, or it might seem obvious, but a lot of it might not be, and this could maybe better put into words what we're seeing. So how do we do this storm relative Hodograph, right? This mythical creature. So this is our normal Hodograph. And let's say we want to draw, well, let's just get out there and draw our most favorite thing to draw, is that kind of Hodograph, right? Like the large humps, low levels, strong wind shear in the upper levels. This is what you want if you want to see tornadoes, or if you're forecasting tornadoes. Let me get something out here really quick, first of all. What I've drawn is a Hodograph. I've also drawn your bunker's right storm motion. Lo and behold, our storms, before they are born into supercell, before they become supercells, as we're birthing these cumulus clouds and the thunderstorms, they're not moving with this vector, okay? And that's, I feel like, sometimes forgotten. And the reason I say that is because you've seen forecasts saying, well, the SRH is high today, therefore supercells are a decent possibility. And although that statement has merit, you're essentially using SRH, storm relative felicity, for a right moving storm. So that assumes that you have a supercell. So if you're forecasting supercells, I'm first going to say, okay, well, what is my cloud going to be doing initially before it even becomes a supercell? And I feel like that gets lost in translation sometimes, but it's this guy here, your mean wind vector. And obviously those of us who are more experienced, like we use this a lot. And what I'm trying to I'm just trying to iron out the instances where we don't use this. And what I guess bugs me just a little bit is that we don't have readily available forecasts of mean wind variables, like mean wind SRH in the 1 to 3 kilometers. Huge. The past, like right now is the end of 2018, and we've had a few events that have busted, I guess, so to speak, with respect to any sort of severe weather and even supercells. And what I'm trying to argue is that this mean wind, like the helicity that's available to it, is incredibly important, because we end up not getting supercells in these days, and we're like, okay, like how'd that happen? And it's this, because before a storm is a supercell, it is using the hodograph that is governed by this guy right here, not this guy, this guy. So, you know what, and we'll, for this we're going to assume, because we like supercells, the rest of the day we're going to assume that this is what's going on here. But when you're predicting if supercells are going to happen, you can't use this. It's irrelevant. Nothing moves by this before the event happens. Okay, so where can we begin? First, we can design the StormRelative Hodograph. Instances of this have been done by basically your first step, moving this right motion vector guy, just moving him down here. So you get something that looks like that if I transpose it right. So that's all I did, is I dropped this down to the origin, all on fine. Where you really start getting your insights though, is if you, let's say we're moving at this 45-degree angle up here. We're going to take that angle and we're just going to make that go straight up and down like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep this right motion guy at the surface, and instead kind of just shift the hodograph, just like that. Maybe butchered that slightly, but if I redraw this, you shall see that possibly the most stereotypical dreamy tornadic hodograph that we can think up looks something like that. So we've got our right motion here, it's moving along here. So these are the winds that it experiences. Like this is exactly what it feels. We have kind of from our front maybe a little bit to the right, we have our this is our surface flow, so our inflow is coming at us from the front, maybe a little bit to the right. At 1 kilometer, we kind of have a equal front-right quadrant wind coming at us. Once we get up to 2 kilometers, it might be hitting our right side directly. And then once we get above this, 3, 4, 5 or so, our wind is mainly blowing in our face if we're in the storm and we're moving forward. So essentially, this is all we're doing. And I found this exceedingly useful because now we've gotten rid of the bias of having fast storm motions or hodographs that are off. Literally, like there's hodographs that are off the charts, right? Like they're way up here, and if you see this like on a modeled sounding, you're like, oh joy, look at all this SRA, look at all this wind shear we have. And the fact of the matter is that this hodograph that just looks extreme because it's off the hodograph might look something exactly like this, like slightly a little bit more reasonable. Second thing is we had an event back in 2017 in Wyoming that kind of made this like the awkward hodograph orientations a thing, but it looks something like this. And it's very awkward to see this actually in person, and like you're trying to tilt your head or whatnot. But in actuality, once we rotate it back to normal, it might look something like this. So I guess like my main point with these is that they're, you might say that like hodographs are like, there's no two snowflakes alike. But once you normalize these, you're going to actually find out that there's a lot of patterns that come together in what you see visually, and then what kind of hazards may evolve from that. Alright, so now what we have is this new magical conceptual model, for many of us new, conceptual model of what a hodograph could look like. in a storm relative sense, right? And now we're going to use that because I think it's very important, and that's why you're probably watching this video. So if we take our quintessential, I guess you could say, tornadic hodograph, again, we're assuming our storm motion is going up along this hodograph, and this is what's going on around us. That is our wind profile. So what I could do is make any sort of tiny change to this hodograph, and now it might mean a lot more than if I were to just look at one of our extreme examples where this hodograph was off the chart and you couldn't see half of it. I guess I just really like being able to centerize this or normalize this hodograph into something that's a lot more manageable. Now we can take and tweak any little part of this and be like, hey, this might make this change, or this might make that change. And not have to worry about any of the weird geometrical biases that we have because we're not in the storm relative sense. Okay, so I could now take this hodograph and instead I could draw it like this, right? They're pretty much the same hodograph, or they look about the same. All I did was just rotate them around in the storm relative sense. So now I could draw Supercell numero uno in black. I'm gonna actually draw it differently to make this make a little more sense. I'm going to draw it somewhat like this, and I'm going to show you that we're gonna make all these, because the nifty thing about storm relative is that you can make these go any direction you want. So I'm gonna make this go north just out of ease, because we're dealing with these in up is this way. So all these are going to be drawn north up. So we could draw number 1, it's probably going to look something like that. If we draw number 2, might look something like that. So what did I change, right? Both these supercells are moving to the north. All I did was change the direction right now that our upper level winds are venting our precip around. Because if I'm the storm and the wind, these are our storm relative winds, they're coming at me from my back left, or potentially even my due left if I wrap this around even more. What it's going to do is, due to my precip, is it's going to wrap it around my face and it's going to cover me up from you. So I'm basically getting shielded by rain in my direction of motion, obscuring my view ahead of me. So this is what happens, right? Like there's this obscuring motion, there's our storm relative winds blowing our precipitation around our path. So even this, as you could potentially see, is going to have huge impacts on just storm spotting. We haven't gotten to many other hazards yet, but even in a storm spotting sense, a storm like this might be potentially a lot easier to keep track of, follow, than something like this, because it is literally raining and hailing in the direction that you need to be going in order to stay ahead of it, per se. Whereas number 1 right here, it might be a little bit more of a classic, you're just going to follow this, the clear slot as it keeps progressing. This is a supercell that kind of maybe immortalized the word like the notch, right, or the info notch. And because you need to stay in it to see what's going on inside of it, and that's kind of a dangerous scenario if you play that game. And how this thing translates, you're going to be butt up against a wall cloud and heavy rain and hail this entire time, and that's not exactly a great place to be. So I could also, well, what if we want a really easy one to chase or spot or whatever? I could end up drawing this hodograph something more like this. And then that's the opposite of the blue one. All I did was wrap the rain around the other side. And now we have a gorgeous storm to chase. We could just perch ourselves right here. What this is also going to do is open up views of the mesocyclone. Because we had rain obscuring part of the mesocyclone both these times. Imagine your spotter right here. You're looking down as the storm is coming toward you. The storm is unraveling itself for you to see its entire mesocyclone. So these, you're probably more used to seeing these maybe in more upslope regimes as they come down from the north. And you can see they're beautiful mesocyclone because they have all that rain tucked behind it. And I guess I'm going to get to that in a couple minutes, what each of these kind of like subtypes of photographs are. But you can see already, we haven't even changed the shape of the hodograph, but it's having enormous impacts on what we can see visually and what we can actually do when it comes to storm spotting. Alright, so now that we've started to at least scratch the surface and like picking apart these photographs and what just simple rotations can do to the storm type, I kind of want to go over a few types that I've personally seen out in the wild repeat themselves. And again, like, you're going to say at first no photographs are alike, and you're going to be correct if you're looking at a non-storm relative sense. But what you're going to figure out is that once you look at these in a storm relative sense, a lot of patterns are going to start repeating themselves. And you might get a couple photographs that look very similar, and then you can say, hey, I've seen this before. I've seen it traveling 50 miles per hour, and now this one's traveling only 10, but I've seen this before. The shape of the storm relative winds, which is really the only thing that matters to a large degree in sculpting the supercell. So I'll first start out, do kind of like a climatology. This is the first like subtype that I've seen, kind of the most blatantly obvious at times. This is what I'd call our classic tornadic hodograph or classic supercell hodograph, what have you. The one we all kind of dream about. So what we have is, again, we have storm relative winds coming at us from in front in the low levels, and then our storm relative ventilations above our heads are going straight out from behind us. So what this is going to do is create a supercell that effectively moves along its forward flank region, right? Because there's very little in the way of storm relative ventilation off to the right, so there's no reason for a lot of precipitation to vent off and wrap around my face, as we talked about earlier. So I could do a bunch of other stuff to this. I could, if I extend my storm relative winds to way out here, we might get something that further defines this side sorting region, maybe elongates the supercell. I could draw it kind of like this. Subtle changes. But essentially we just have a supercell that's moving along its forward flank region and is probably decently easy to spot. You know, I can't begin to kind of explain the effects that this might have on the actual hazards here, but you have a supercell that's moving pretty close to along its own baroclinically generated source of vorticity. So does this have an effect that it's directly feeding its storm motion? I guess that's to be seen. But pretty cool, kind of typical example. But what I want to kind of get at is how are we actually seeing these, or kind of go backwards, like how do we get this storm relative hodograph from nature? How do we get this in the US? Well, we need a hodograph that veers about 180 degrees around storm motion. So if I drew a regular ground relative hodograph that you're used to seeing, let's say we arbitrarily drew our storm motion up right here. So how would I get the storm relative hodograph? I would have a kind of southeasterly component at the surface, and then veer that around to a northeasterly component up above. This is how I got that. But I can also get this a million other ways, right? Like I could draw my storm motion to the northwest at 10 knots or something like that. And what I would do, I could draw that same exact storm relative hodograph. It should in theory have just about the same effects on the storm as this one, and it looks completely different. If you had kind of a northwesterly, almost calm component at the ground veering to easterly to southeasterly, you're going to get the same exact hodograph shape in a storm relative sense as we got from above. So that's kind of how that works. The second kind of subspecies of hodographs that I've seen in the storm relative sense, I guess I'll refer to it as the classic splitting, or maybe includes a little bit of veer back. So you kind of draw a hodograph like we did before, then did something to it like that, kind of vented its wings off in that direction. And so what that's going to do, these obviously can still be highly tornadic, but I could draw these a variety of different ways. I've seen these occur with a lot of different kind of combinations, but they all kind of point to something that looks similar to that. And what that does is you draw your supercell. Maybe this time I'll draw it moving due east instead, but it will appear to move kind of out of its precipitation, which is usually pretty good for storm spotting, especially if it's moving due east along east-west roads. These are actually usually a pretty good treat to see. They're usually not exceedingly beautiful by any means. I'll talk about that later, but they can be potentially very straightforward to spot. And again, you can get the storm relative hodograph. Usually in the US, you would get this hodograph by having your more strong synoptic systems. So you could do something like that, and you'd be moving northeast. You'd have kind of a slightly veered low levels, and then have a continued veering, maybe slight backing with the approach of a strong trough, kind of in the upper levels, and that's going to kind of unshield your precipitation from in front of your storm and make it slightly more beautiful. Next subtype I have is something that is a little bit different from the last two, and it is kind of what I refer to as the classic for upslope supercells. So I would have something that kind of looks like this in the storm relative sense. So again, you could see this on a normal hodograph and it might not look all that weird to you, but now after we've dealt with the first two, what is this? Like, this is pretty weird looking. But what this is pure beauty, because if your storm is moving this way, all of our precipitation is going to be neatly tucked away to the left of my motion, a lot of it actually behind me. So if I were to draw the supercell, we're most used to seeing it usually come from almost the north, and have an almost due south dive, even maybe a southwesterly dive with this hodograph. And again, that's going to yield us like spectacular views of the mesocyclone within there, because all the precip is being neatly shunted behind it. And so these are usually painfully easy to go on spot. You just kind of sit in the road and just watch it come down toward you. They appear to move kind of like RFD first or mesocyclone first, and have the whole structure kind of coming at you. So how do we get this in a normal sense, ground relative sense? Usually in our upslope events, we have some decent clip of easterly winds at the surface, or upslope winds. And we actually might have like a weakness in our mid-levels, and that's going to allow the storm to deviate a little bit south of the hodograph. So we could have something like this, and then our upper level winds will have like a decent jet up above that. So if our storm would be moving due south, this is kind of how we got that. Might not be to scale, but again, there's no perfect in the world of hodographs. And you can get this a variety of other ways, right? If we wanted a southwestern moving storm, which indeed is possible, you can kind of loop this hodograph like that. And this is, you can see this. If you get northwest flow in Colorado, northeast Colorado, and you got your southeasterly surface flow, this is totally possible. And that's why we see a lot of these examples out on the high plains, is because that is the kind of climatology that favors these, right? Your upslope flow, your weakness in the middle, and then your jet off to the in the upper levels. So the next one is actually going to kind of feed off this one, slightly in terms of appearance, but it's created in a different way. Your storm motion is actually, these hodographs are only possible if your storm is typically accelerating beyond what was actually predicted by Bunkers Wright. I've actually noticed it's very hard to come by these hodographs via looking at models, but they actually do occur when you have greatly accelerated supercell speeds, and that can happen A, with strong cold pools, and B, by embedding yourself within a QLCS. Both are going to tend to increase your supercell speed beyond what is actually typical of that environment. So the way we would create this hodograph is by, actually it might be easier to kind of draw something like this, and then what we're going to do is increase your storm speed. So relative to this hodograph, that would put your storm speed kind of up here with regards to this hodograph. So in that same sense, I could just shift this downward, and it could look something like this. Greatly exaggerated, I can draw a little bit more to proportion. And so what this is going to do is, right, we could draw our heights again. So you might have something like this. What this is going to do is put a very strong component of storm relative flow at many of your levels throughout your storm depth. Before, we only had our strong, like, against us storm relative flow in the first couple kilometers. Now we've increased that to 4. We could increase that even more if I drew the hodograph like this, 5, 6. Now we have 6 kilometers of wind pushing against us. Well, what's that going to do? It's a really funky shape of supercell. I'm going to try not to butcher this, but it really, I butchered it for sure. Let's try that once more. It really appears to kind of like come out at you. That's slightly better, but you get the picture. Like it's these where your hook echo kind of seems to kick out in front of the storm, and you've typically maybe associated these with being extremely windy and packing a big punch in terms of wind, and that's physically because these are driven by very strong RFDs, very strong cold pools. And so this, whenever you see this shape that your RFD is kicking ahead of the rest of the storm, that's typically a washout. We're gonna get punched. And these can actually also appear. This is the isolated variety. These storms kind of start out as supercells. These are actually you get this hodograph when your storm is transitioning often into like a strong single cell bow echo kind of thing. You'll transform into this hodograph. You'll have a supercell that initially looks a little bit more normal, and then it ends up morphing into this shape. And again, it's not because your RFD per se is actually that strong sometimes. It's because your upper level ventilation is that strong. It's kind of a backwards way of thinking, but you have this strong upper level ventilation throughout such a depth that you're going to hold all your precip and bay way behind you. Another cool thing about these is that they could be incredibly HP, incredibly wet, large hail within the actual core, but because you have this much storm relative flow keeping you dry, you often have very large bases. I've seen, these are most common, actually I'm going to pick on like the Rapid City area down toward the northwest Kansas area. These are somehow a hot spot for these, probably because it's pretty dry and you usually have high base storms. But you'll get a lot of storms that do look like this and then evolve into bow echoes. But you can get this if you just planted a supercell within a QLCS or a line merged with it and cause it to accelerate. And then what you're going to see is your classic, like, very strong RFD ahead of the rest of the line. This is kind of like the comma shape that people have noted. I could even draw that a little bit more representative, like you might have your forward flank region like well out that way, because you're accelerating the lower levels so far out. So yeah, that is where you'll typically see those. Again, your hodographs will vary, but they'll kind of tend to maybe look like your upslope variety that we talked about the last one first, and then kind of transition to a more this sort of structure as they move along the hodograph or move faster. What else we got? Isn't that one cool? Mm-hmm. I like that one. So the next one I want to talk about is kind of the HP monster, or the classic HP mode supercell structure. And to get this, you're going to kind of start off where you normally do, and then wrap your hodograph around a lot. That might be a little bit over-exaggerating, but as long as the upper levels of that hodograph end up somewhere in this far right quadrant, you're pretty much banking on an HP storm as interpreted by you, regardless of often how moist the atmosphere actually is. This is going to tend toward HP, because again, like if I'm going to take a bucket of water and I spin myself around, it's going to create a curtain of water all over me, or all around me. So this is how these kind of come to fruition. You're getting ventilation around all sides of your storm, and what that's going to do is just shield you from all angles. So this is definitely the storm where like the notch was kind of made for, the inflow notch, and how to stay in there. So I could draw one that potentially would look like this, right? Maybe a northwest flow event. This is typically what you'd see in almost a northerly flow, actually. But your storm would be moving down like this, and your challenge would be then to stay in this notch the entire time in stair step, and that's not ideal. And there's not a lot of good views you can get on this thing, because most of your inflow is taken up by precipitation. Whereas maybe in our other more classic storms, you have this very broad region that you can see things out of. This one is very pinched. So this obviously makes it pretty hard for spotting. And I guess the last subtype that I feel like I've seen more commonly than others is kind of your classic stationary mothership-y kind of variety. And how to create that is you take, basically give yourself a strong half circle hodograph, and then weak upper level winds. This might be slightly exaggerated. I've seen other examples that are essentially like this, maybe add a little bit more flow. But the whole key is here, in order to get a stationary storm, you need obviously slow wind speeds in the upper levels, right? Because those are your steering flow. So in order to get a supercell then, if you have weak upper level flow, you need a lot of hodograph curvature in the low levels. So that's kind of what we did here. This is going to provide the storm enough SRH to become a supercell, while also still making it slow. So what this is going to do, and there's been a few varieties, you can, because they're stationary, that's the issue. The StormRelative Hodograph actually doesn't work as well, or I guess is less useful in that sense, because you could tilt this any way you really want to. But what you could also have is hodographs that are displaced, and you can have a hodograph that looks somewhat like this and still have a storm motion. Typically these move north. I will draw one right here. Typically they look something like this, a lot of curvature in the supercell, maybe not too much, but enough. And they'll either move stationary or north, is what I've usually found, or like north into their own core. So obviously, yeah, this hodograph, just like our last one, is a bit problematic because you have your supercell and it's moving into its own core. So what does that mean for tornadogenesis? What does that mean for other hazards that could arise? That's up to interpretation. But these do have effects on how what kind of hazards your storm can't get, especially if it's stationary. It's going to be sitting in its own, it's going to make a cold pool eventually, and it's going to be sitting in that the entire time. So how is that going to affect different hazards that you can get? So one thing I found, like one pro tip for these that I found is no matter what direction the storm is moving, because we're on the plains, usually we're getting these are your typical day before the day, if you will, low moisture but beautiful hodographs. And these are created usually on the western plains, where you have a very strong low-level jet to give you all that curvature, and you also have weak flow before the day trough comes in and gives you your upper level flow. So in a non-storm relative sense is what you'll get is something that looks like this. This is a faster storm motion variety, but you'll have this very large loop around it, and with relatively minimal shear in the upper levels. So what I would do is, my favorite thing to do is stay behind these and just kind of foul them up, because what all this rain is doing is being ventilated ahead of the storm for where it's moving, revealing the usually beautiful mothership, spaceshipy structure behind the storm relative to its motion. So this is typically where you want to be from these. If you're coming in from the north, you're just going to get a lot of rain and hail, and a couple peaks at the mesocyclone. But this is you kind of want to follow these, so to speak. So to piggyback off that example a little bit, this is not necessarily something that's unique to a storm relative viewpoint. In fact, you can see it all the time pretty easily, but is this measure of how much or how streamwise our vorticity is at many different levels and how strong our storm relative winds are. So if we did have this example that we talked about earlier, this is a non-storm relative sense, your vorticity, right, your vorticity vector would be pointed outward from the hodograph, and your storm relative wind vector would be pointing directly parallel to that. And the deeper that you have this perfectly streamwise vorticity, the more your supercell tends to enter this kind of solid body rotation. And really, a supercell, like we picture a supercell as like a spinning vortex, and it's not exactly that, right? If we have a hodograph that looks more like this one, you have a lot of upper level ventilation away from the updraft. So what usually ends up occurring is that you have a parcel that enters the updraft and gets ventilated straight out somewhere else. But these are kind of able to, especially since they're usually more stationary, develop your mothershipy, your classic spaceship-like structures, just because of that. They're usually more well-rounded. These are typically a bit more leaning. The more wind shear that you have past your storm motion vector, the more upper level ventilation you're going to have, and your tower is kind of going to be your leaning skeletal variety. So obviously what's the big hot topic here is I went over kind of like how this could be helpful for storm spotting, but how could this affect the actual science behind how tornadoes form, what kind of hazards these could deal? And the truth is, like, I don't know, and I don't have the right to tell you that I know what's going on, because I don't, but I have theories. And even if we just took a single supercell shape like this, and we impacted its motion again, these are all completely different storm relative photographs I'm creating. What are these going to be doing? Right, like this one right here is moving almost directly along where its kind of forward flank convergence boundary would set up. What does that have to do with what kind of baroclinic vorticity it ingests? What do these storm motions up here, how do those influence the storm stepping into its own cold pool, right? Like, how detrimental is that, especially if your storm is moving faster or slower? Storm speed, actually, back in the picture, probably does a lot in terms of how long the ground is, or the boundary layer is given to cool from all of its downdrafts. And this one out here, right, like it's moving completely anti-parallel to where any sort of forward flank convergence boundary or vorticity zone is going to set up. So what do these mean for tornadogenesis? I can't really tell you. I can tell you that looking at a variety of these hodographs has opened my eyes to that it is possible to see or to determine where some of these internal boundaries are going to set up. So if I draw my supercell like this, I'm really hypothesizing that there's a way to figure out shear-wise where your either forward flank convergence boundary, your RFD, or favorable regions for RFD surges, or favorable regions for the RFD to kind of just lag behind the storm like this, based on simply the contributions of environmental barotropic vorticity versus your baroclinic vorticity generated. Like, where is your RFD more apt to surge? Where is it more apt to kind of just hang out and be less disruptive to the storm? This could have huge impacts on how outflow dominant your storm is, or how long it could actually survive without it being disrupted by its own RFD. And potentially even where kind of the new highly talked about observations such as where the SVC, the streamwise vorticity current, like where those set up. I'm kind of using these interchangeably. I guess we don't completely know how to separate the two yet. But SVCs that kind of are oriented in a vastly different sense than this is the precip gradient right here. Like, what would it mean to have an SVC that's either due a long storm motion or not, or what its relationship is within the cold pool? Is the SVC, does that tend to set up kind of out here? Does it tend to set up kind of back here? And that might have big implications on how long-lasting our tornadoes can be. The SVC is kind of becoming established as something that could maintain or strengthen existing tornadoes. So how does that affect either tornado maintenance or even cycling? So I really hope that this was kind of enlightening. This is just something that I found really fascinating and that I really wanted to share with you, because it's really caused me to, or allowed me to look at hodographs in a different way. And now I can pick apart every hodograph that I see, and especially for my own recreational interest, if I were to go storm spotting, what am I going to see? This is essentially, I just had it described to me as seeing your supercell before you even see it, right? And it's very, I feel like it's very cool to be able to do that, because a lot of times you go out and you're like, oh, nature's just going to surprise me today. Well, it's not usually actually all that surprising. Once you look at the hodograph structures, what kind of shape you're going to get. It obviously goes a lot beyond that, and we've completely neglected thermodynamics, but that's another story. But this is kind of like the meat of what your supercell actually experiences, so it's going to have some pretty profound impacts. So if you can kind of train your brain to rotate these a few times, I'm probably going to get some people looking at me like that nowadays. But it's, as long as you're able to kind of do that, I'm sure you'll kind of start to see some patterns. So please, if you found this interesting, if you have something to add, if some of my science wasn't, if you're an expert in some of these fields, please give me a comment. I'd really love any more insight I can into this topic. So thank you so much for watching.